Welcome to the Coalition for Just Reparations new podcast series, More Than Ink on Paper, through which we'll platform relevant voices around the Yazidi Survivors Law, which has too often also been referred to as ink on paper by some survivors of ISIS crimes, to voice their doubts about the government's commitment to delivering long-awaited reparations guaranteed under the legislation. We'll be speaking to those working to ensure that this is not the case and take a sweeping look at issues of transitional justice and accountability in Iraq through the process of seeking to implement the law. Today we're speaking with the head of IOM Iraq's reparation team, Sandra Orlovic. Sandra is a human rights lawyer and activist bringing a wealth of transitional justice experience to Iraq from another post-conflict region, the former Yugoslavia. Sandra is currently based in Iraq, where she leads the IOM Iraq reparations team, supporting the implementation of the Yazidi Survivors Law. Sandra, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you today on behalf of the Iraqi civil society organisations that make up the Coalition for Just Reparations, and also on behalf of the Gian Foundation. For listeners who may be new to these concepts, the Coalition for Just Reparations, C4JR, is an alliance of 33 Iraqi civil society organisations established to help survivors of the ISIS conflict in Iraq realise their right to reparations, working alongside IOM and others as we seek the full implementation of the 2021 Yazidi Survivors Law, which is essentially a comprehensive state-funded reparation programme. And just for a little bit of background, the Yazidi Survivors Law provides reparations if you're a member of one of the following groups: adult and minor female survivors of ISIS captivity from the Yazidi Shabak, Christian or Turkmen communities, male Yazidis who were abducted by ISIS when they were under the age of 18 at the time of abduction, and all persons from the Yazidi Shabak, Christian or Turkmen communities who were abducted by ISIS and personally survived a specific incident of ISIS mass killing. Applications are made to the General Directorate for Survivors Affairs, which is a government body recently established in Iraq under the auspices of the Federal Ministry for Labour and Social Affairs. So let's open at the very beginning. Sandra, thank you for joining us from Baghdad. And my first question is, why is it so important for the Yazidi Survivors Law to reach survivors, and what is the current status of its implementation in Iraq?
Thank you, Alana, and it's a real pleasure and honor to be with you. So the importance of Yazidi Survivors Law is best explained, I guess, through, individual stories of those beneficiaries who already have seen some tangible benefits from the Yazidi Survivors Law. Over 1,000 beneficiaries, mostly women from Yazidi community have already started receiving monthly salaries. Some of them started receiving some basic mental health services, and they say that this law has made some a really important impact in their lives, even though the implementation of the law is on its very beginning. But what they usually cite as one important difference in their lives is that they, like, through the monthly financial salary they really have received, and they are able to be to regain some kind of autonomy and dignity, and be able to make plans for them and their family members without waiting for humanitarian assistance or support and help from other distant family members. So I think in this very practical level, humane level, Yazidi Survivors Law implementation has brought already some positive changes in the survivors' lives. On a more general level, and a level of principles and and changes for the whole community who was affected by genocide. I would say that Yazidi Survivors Law really offered a glimpse of hope and a gesture that means that for Yazidi community, Shabak and Turkmen and Christian community who have been disproportionately affected by ISIS genocide and felt that they were not protected during the ISIS. During the period when ISIS was controlling large swaths of the territory in Iraq, the Yazidi Survivors Law, its adoption in the parliament, and the strong commitment from the Iraqi government to fund the implementation of this law are signaling to these communities that the authorities in Iraq care for these communities and they want to provide redress and official recognition, which can show them that they are wanted in this country and they have future in this country.
Yeah.
Yazidi Survivors Law is, I would say, is a very aspirational law, aspirational transitional justice law, and it covers not only reparations but also calls for justice and accountability for genocide and search for missing persons and memorialization. So it is really important to continue efforts for its implementation.
Thank you. From a technical perspective, of course, legislation envisioning such a comprehensive services is and would be very difficult to implement anywhere, not least in Iraq. So I wonder if alongside that you could also reflect on the last few years in particular, and some of the milestones and challenges, because of course it's only been a couple of years since this legislation was passed and the first reparations were just sort of dispersed just this year. So it's been quite recent successes, but I'm sure plenty of years of preparation before that, which would be interesting to share.
Thanks, Alana. I think that based on the criteria for readiness of institutions for implementation of this law in other countries, based on these criteria in other countries that have similar laws, if they were applied in Iraq, the laws would still not be implemented, because the main institution in Iraq who is in charge for the implementation of Yazidi Survivors Law really still didn't receive the key resources for the implementation. And the key resource for implementation of this law are people, are employees of the institutions who need to implement this law. Now we can, some people are very critical, saying, why Directorate doesn't have more employees, why they are not more effective. And we can see, and whoever lives in Iraq and follows the situation in Iraq sees that it's not really about lack of political will to support the Directorate. It's rather the reality of political life and system in Iraq, which in past several years really, and even if you want decades, is really going through a chain of crises, consecutive crises, in which it's a political crisis with the cycles of violence, and so all this really has effect on the establishment of the Directorate and completion of the recruitment process and getting all the resources needed for the Directorate. In other words, I think that Directorate management and the head of the Directorate really have made a very brave decision to start with the implementation of the law, and especially with the application process, even though they didn't have really all necessary, or even almost any necessary preconditions and resources to start this implementation. And there is where the international community, IOM, and other organizations, and also local organizations really supported this process. And this support was really instrumental for start of the application process. As you said, the application process and implementation of this law is challenging, would be challenging in any country, let alone in Iraq. And we can see those challenges, and those challenges are discussed in a public domain. And I think there is quite a good dialogue and openness among all who are supporting this process on what are the challenges, but also what are the causes of these challenges, and what are the responses to these challenges, and what's the role of each of us in this process and how to address these challenges.
Thank you. If I could speak a little bit about the legislation itself. So IOM and yourself have been supporting Iraqi authorities, designing consultations and also sort of in the passing of the Yazidi Survivors Law. And it's raised often among communities that, certain sections of the bill submitted by the President of Iraq back in 2019 were cut out. For example, one of them on the position of children born of sexual violence. But actually what landed in the final version is objectively quite a remarkable piece of legislation. And I guess I wanted to ask whether you could, speak of your view of the final version of the Yazidi Survivors Law as it was enacted in Parliament, and, what you consider the most important provisions of the Yazidi Survivors Law, and also linked to that, the ones which, we're seeing are the most challenging to implement.
Yes, the most important dimension or feature of the Yazidi Survivors Law is probably its holistic nature, because it really calls for implementation of holistic transitional justice when it comes to survivors of genocide from these four communities. And it's really rare to see on a global level in some other countries who went through comparatively similar experiences of conflict and genocide, that they adopt such a comprehensive framework. It is a very short law. It's only 13 articles, but still it gives a very, very strong foundation for transitional justice process. Yes, the focus is on reparations for a reason. Reparations primarily for women who have been subjected to captivity of ISIS, and we all know that this was followed in most of the cases by brutal sexual violence. That feature of the law is really extraordinary. The second feature that is extraordinary is this specific focus on women who survived captivity of ISIS and who went through the brutal experience of sexual violence and sexual slavery. Iraq is just among a few countries in the world who recognizes this civilian victims, this specific category of civilian survivors of genocide, as a separate category without using any vague terms, but rather determining this category in very plain, clear, and emphatic words. And this is really, and Iraq is definitely the first country in the Arab world to have such an approach in redressing survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. So yes, I think these two features are in my view, the most extraordinary ones. But I guess everyone have maybe some other part of the law that finds it. So I also want to say that I think one very, very peculiar feature of this law is mentioning of survivors who are now living outside of Iraq.
Yes.
And not only that the law has mentioned that these beneficiaries, these survivors who have left the country, and we know that hundreds of survivors and their families have been resettled to Germany, Australia, USA, Sweden, and a few other countries, that they will benefit from the law. But in fact, in among the 1,300 beneficiaries who have not, until now verified by the committee for the verification, there are, I think, around 200 survivors who live outside and benefiting from the laws. I think this, I would definitely emphasize this feature of the law as well.
Thank you. And I wonder if, slightly linking to this, but kind of taking a step backwards, it's quite interesting how, IOM has become quite involved in supporting the reparations sort of program and process in Iraq. And perhaps when, people who are not sort of so directly involved in Iraq or frankly, any other country, think of IOM, we should just explain, is the UN's International Organization for Migration. They probably think of, migrant protection and that sort of form of humanitarian assistance. But obviously in the case of the Yazidi Survivors Law, IOM has played a really pivotal role in providing technical assistance to Iraqi institutions and civil society and survivors. And I know that you're really busy in Baghdad doing that sort of thing. So I guess I suppose it'd be interesting to ask how IOM sort of found itself in the reparation business, so to speak, particularly in Iraq, but wherever else it applies.
Yes, thanks. You are completely right, and we get this question very often. It's not an intuitive thing to think of IOM as somebody who has a mandate in supporting reparation programs in any country, but our involvement is coming from how to say through two tracks. One is historical. IOM establishment of the International Organization for Migration came after the Second World War, where IOM was basically involved in supporting refugees moving from one country to another, going back to place of their residence, and based on that, the German government fast forward, based on that kind of involvement, fast forward on the early 2000s, German government asked IOM to facilitate the second biggest reparation program related to the Second World War, where German government was paying compensation to victims of slave and forced labor workers during Second World War, and IOM was basically facilitating compensation claims and claims process in dozens of countries around the world. And that was a huge endeavor for the whole organization. I think there were more than 200,000 claims that were processed through IOM, and slowly after that involvement, IOM was also involved in the reparation program for Roma Holocaust and a few other smaller reparation programs in relation to Second World War. And then this in-house expertise slowly started to be applied to ongoing or just recently ended conflicts around the world, including Sierra Leone, including Sri Lanka, Colombia, where IOM still has the biggest transitional justice program and working directly with the government in implementation of their transitional justice framework. Iraq, of course, Bosnia, and a couple of more countries. So this is kind of a historical genesis of involvement of IOM in the transitional justice and especially reparation programs. But there is also one important a link, and this is the second track through which IOM is entering into these processes, where we really can see the link between reparation programs and our core mandate. And our core mandate is to support migration, and within the migration, dignified migration, and through which also we are addressing, especially in the post-conflict countries, core drivers of migration, and in this region, and through our regional strategy for this region, one of our main tasks as organization is really to address these core drivers of conflict. And if you look into the context of these countries in this region, but also some other regions in the world, main drivers of conflicts are lack of access to justice, and people often migrate illegally, searching for better lives, searching for better protection, access to justice, leaving these countries and going to Western Europe or other countries, other regions where they feel they will find more safety, more recognition, better governance, access to justice, protection of their rights, etc., etc. So, in this sense, the reparation programs, which are there designed, yes, to support survivors to heal and to restore their rights, but also to show the new face of the government and readiness of the government to provide redress for wrongdoings and or lack of protection of their citizens. This really fits well into the mandate of IOM, and of course, more broadly speaking, into the general framework of sustainable development goals, where the access to justice and peace is basically the development goal that is in the mandate of basically all UN agencies.
Yeah. Thank you. That was such a helpful answer. And I guess it might be too simple to follow that up with, the appetite that you're seeing among sort of Iraqi officials to support you with these efforts, because of course we've seen a lot of progress over this past year. An aspect of the Yazidi Survivors Law, which I think is quite interesting, is also, we talked about the fact that it goes well beyond the common understanding of reparations because it's so comprehensive. One of the parts of the YSL is also the kind of pursuit of criminal justice, which of course we know is really challenging in Iraq, and it sort of spells out the aim to prevent the reoccurrence of violations. So it's kind of more of a sort of transitional justice framework than a conventional reparation legislation, and that involves a lot of buy-in from different sectors of government and across the country. And I guess linked to the question I just asked about the role of IOM and how the sort of the involvement in the concept came about, I guess I'd like to ask, how much do you see government officials in particular being really supportive of these aspects of the Yazidi Survivors Law, as well as the more perhaps easy to understand, sort of land, housing, education, that sort of thing?
Well, accountability for genocide and crimes against humanity, I think, is the topic that is now very high on the political agenda in Iraq, especially after the announcement and the last Security Council resolution regarding UNITAD and the extension of their mandate only until September 2024. And I saw the letter that came from the civil society organizations and survivors in relation to ending of the UNITAD mandate, which raised legitimate concerns on the side of the the civil society and survivors, that this accountability was really very, very strongly tied with the UNITAD mandate. And there are fears now that with the end of the UNITAD mandate, this prospects for accountability for genocide and crimes against humanity may simply disappear in Baghdad. But I also saw the response from the Prime Minister Sudani to this letter, where there are some strong commitments made by this government in relation to pursuing accountability for genocide crimes against humanity, and preparation of the draft legislation for prosecution of genocide and crimes against humanity. And IOM did support the Directorate for Survivors Affairs to facilitate several national dialogue sessions with some institutions in Iraq about this legislation. I think that next 6 to 10 months will be really, really interesting in this respect. There is, of course, a lot of strong demands that are coming from survivors and communities and civil society organizations, expectations that the government will deliver on the promise of accountability for genocide and crimes against humanity, because as in any other society, not seeing that part of the transitional justice and not seeing justice in the courtroom would feel as an incomplete justice process for this community, regardless of the fact that the implementation of the reparation program goes very well, not without problems, but goes very well, even though the reparation program from the Yazidi Survivors Law is implemented in a perfect way. If there is no accountability process for genocide and crimes against humanity, I feel that survivors and victims communities will be disappointed and will feel let down. I am hopeful. And optimistic, and we are really from IOM side, of course, we are trying to support both the government and civil society and survivors as well, to continue advocacy and to continue dialogue towards really getting to the desired aim, and that is the legislation which will enable prosecution of ISIS members for genocide and crimes against humanity in Iraq.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we'll be following the UNITAD kind of roadmap to sort of pulling out essentially. So we'll see how that progresses. And I totally agree with you. A lot of the organizations that make up C4JR have been horrified about this news and very concerned. So we'll have to see whether sort of the government, I guess, I think the onus is on them to try to alleviate some of these concerns in collaboration, I hope, with IOM. And I guess linked to that slightly, I had to ask about the recent issues that have been affecting survivors who have had to make criminal complaints through courts in Iraq in order to sort of submit formal investigation documents for their applications to be considered to the Yazidi Survivors Law, which is a procedure that is actually not mandated within the YSL or its regulations, but was a result of the decision made by the Article 10 committee. And so, we've seen, again, a bit of pushback against that, certain survivors struggling to have their claims processed. And C4JR's sort of position is that this goes against the spirit and the intent of the law, which was designed to sort of have relaxed evidentiary standards to ease the application process. Of course, critics say that it's necessary to have such checks in place to sort of reduce or mitigate the risk of false claims. essentially it leaves potentially some of the most vulnerable survivors outside of the YSL's reach, including Yazidi children and potentially also, you know, others who are outside of Iraq and unable to submit those documents. So it's a long-winded way of saying, what is IOM's position, you know, regarding this, and how can we overcome the challenges faced in this particular situation?
Well, we really do agree with the assessment that this additional requirement that came after the application process started and after the bylaws which regulate the application process were adopted, that this was really unfortunate development. And from everything we know, we feel that this requirement really didn't bring anything positive to the process, just quite opposite, as you said, added additional burden to survivors, and simply, you know, prolonged the procedure, made it difficult for some survivors to access reparations, and definitely will, if it remains there, definitely will keep a number of survivors outside of the reparation program, whether these are survivors from non-Yazidi communities, or these are Yazidi children, or those survivors who are outside of the country. I know that there was, and I am participant of many efforts, really many advocacy efforts, both from the directorate side and government side, and also civil society side and the UN side, really to try to advocate for removal of this requirement. But now we are 1 year into the application process, and within which this requirement was there. And I think there is still a chance, of course, but you know, it's already 1 year into the process, and the chances are slimmer than they were a year ago. I guess the simple answer really is that we do agree that this was a disappointing development, and especially because both the law and the bylaws really do not mention this requirement as a mandatory requirement. Of course, court documents were mentioned as one of the possible evidences, but not as a mandatory evidence.
Yeah.
There are things probably that still can be done, that maybe this additional requirement doesn't have such a strong effect on an impact on survivors, such as improving collaboration between the federal institutions and Kurdistan institutions in terms of the sharing of the evidence. But this is really something outside of the purview of the United Nations and IOM, and I think everybody are more or less very much aware of the problems and trying to find solutions.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess it's interesting as well, you know, to be more connected to like individual cases. For example, on paper, the process, you know, makes sense, but the more that you speak to people who are going through it themselves, you realize that the realities on the ground can be pretty challenging. So I guess linked to that somehow, the C4JR obviously is a collection of different Iraqi civil society organizations that are seeking to raise certain issues, such as this particular example, but also others in terms of helping and supporting survivors to realize their right to reparations under the YSL. And I guess just sort of asking you for your views, what do you think, you know, what sort of role should these CSOs be playing, and do you think they play a valuable role in amplifying issues specifically regarding to the YSL?
Yes, I believe that civil society organizations in Iraq have been playing really an amazing role from the very start of the discussion around the Yazidi Survivors Law and deliberations on the content of them, the elements of the law, and then after the adoption, the inputs and advocacy and pressure of the civil society organizations. For example, when it came to the application process procedure and the evidentiary standards and the content of these bylaws that were adopted for regulating application procedure, the role of civil society organizations was really key for at least on paper, keeping this survivor-centered approach, because really what bylaws have at the end included, were the rules for application procedure, which is survivor-centered. Unfortunately, the additional requirement came after the start of the application process, and it's outside of the bylaws. It's more related to some other frameworks. But the strength and the value of civil society organizations could have been seen really in that phase very clearly. Now, moving with the implementation, civil society organizations are playing important role in awareness raising about the Yazidi survivors. So some of them helping also survivors with application process. A few of the members of the Coalition for Just Reparations, such as Farida Global or Yazda and some other organizations, really supported dozens, if not hundreds, of survivors to apply and get to the application, and also some NGOs from other non-Yazidi communities as well. Basically, maybe it is worth emphasizing that, especially survivors from non-Yazidi communities, Shabak and Turkmen, the support that they received from the local activists and organizations is the support that they couldn't find anywhere else, and they wouldn't be able to apply and be guided through this process if there weren't for these organizations and activists. I think that there is more work to be done, and especially in terms of the awareness raising about the application process. Sometimes there are certain information that are not completely true, or that there was some update in the procedure that civil society organizations are not aware of, and then that maybe the right information is not shared within the community. But I see here also a responsibility of IOM and other international organizations who might support more organizations to do this job.
Yep.
And lastly, the role that is now the role of civil society that is now becoming increasingly important is the role in very formal partnership with the Directorate for Survivors Affairs in relation to the provision of mental health and psychosocial services. As we know, this component of the Yazidi Survivors Law, the rehabilitation part of the Yazidi Survivors Law, is probably the most challenging component. It will take years to have institutionalized rehabilitation support within Yazidi Survivors Law. And in the meantime, until the Directorate and Ministry of Health come to that point where they will be able to open centers, specialized centers for support to survivors, they're relying now on civil society organizations, and the Directorate has signed agreements and partnerships with several organizations in Iraq who are receiving referred survivors from the Directorate and providing them services in line with their capacity and expertise. So there is a lot of work to be done. There are things that can be improved, especially in relation to awareness raising and information sharing. But I think everybody are on the same page in terms of everybody really wanting to see benefits from the Yazidi Survivors Law being delivered as soon as possible to survivors.
Yeah, thank you. And a good point about the mental health provision, because actually many of the NGOs who've been tasked with carrying out this support are, members themselves of C4JR. So you can see the connections between civil society and authorities pretty clearly. Quickly, I guess this is just sort of to add to that, and you've touched on it throughout the interview, but it's often said that, the right to reparations after an armed conflict in particular is established like under international law, but it's the implementation that often falls behind. And I guess, it's wonderful to see so many people very, positive about the Yazidi Survivors Law and hopeful for its full implementation. But there is also a cynicism among, many perhaps survivors, but also, people in Iraq who worry that this pattern may continue. So I wonder if you have any advice or sort of hope to share on how we can sort of overcome these challenges globally, but particularly in Iraq, to sort of maintain pressure, I suppose, on the legislation, but also all that it entails.
Yes, well, you're exactly right. There are many examples of countries with adopted legislation on reparations, but the implementation really fell through. But I am a bit more hopeful for the implementation of this law in Iraq, especially because the most common reason for interruption of implementation or incomplete implementation of reparation programs is funding, financial resources. And usually, as you know, in post-conflict periods, governments are grappling with the financial crisis, with the lack of budget revenues, and huge need for investment in reconstruction of infrastructure, etc. I think Iraq is in a bit different situation. It has a very strong revenues and very strong budget. Of course, it has a lot of competing priorities, including the development and infrastructure investments and creating employment opportunities. But I think, in a way, I think that, in a broader scheme of things, having Yazidi Survivors Law with estimated probably somewhere around 5,000 beneficiaries and some, estimated, costs for these benefits, I think this would really not become a big burden for Iraq government anytime soon. Where I see the bigger challenge, and this is something where the next 2 or 3 years will be critical, is really institutionalizing some of these components of the Yazidi Survivors Law, especially when it comes to reparation program. And here I think I refer specifically on these rehabilitation and healthcare centers that are very clear promise within the Yazidi Survivors Law. This will be like really this will require a lot of resources and a lot of energy and effort, not only from the Directorate for Survivors Affairs, because this institution cannot do it on their own, but engagement really of several ministries and other agencies, because the general landscape in Iraq is such that there are really lack of adequate resources in the healthcare system, and especially in the area of specialized services. So this will be really an uphill battle.
Yeah.
And I would say that this component of the MHPSS and institutionalized MHPSS services and rehabilitation, access to rehabilitation institutions will be a real benchmark, real milestone for the success of the Yazidi Survivors Law implementation. The first one is, I think we are already there. We can already see it. 1,300 survivors were verified in just 1 year of allocation process, which is by far much more efficient than similar processes in other countries who have similar reparation programs. That is a really, really, extraordinary milestone. I would say the next milestone will be this component on rehabilitation, and it will take a year or two, but I think there are already some signs, and IOM is supporting the Directorate towards starting this process of developing these rehabilitation centers. And it's very, very early, but I see the recognition on the side of the government that this is really needed, that without this, the implementation of law will be incomplete.
Thank you. That's a great answer, because one of my other questions is, how can we judge the success of the implementation of the Yazidi Survivors Law? So, and I know that, other people might say, well, it's education or land or housing or that kind of thing. Of course, there are so many different aspects of the law that you could pick practically anything, but it's great to know that. And also, we should say for listeners that IOM have concluded an agreement to support the General Directorate for Survivors Affairs, which seems pretty promising that IOM is kind of here to stay and support the implementation. Is that correct to say?
Yes, definitely. We have plans for next 2 or 3 years with the Directorate and support of the international community. There is a really, this is also one thing, that there is a really strong interest on the side of international community, for seeing this law implemented. And I think in pair with the financial commitments made by the Iraqi government and political commitments made by the Iraqi government, the chances are really good. There is a lot of work. There is a lot of challenges. Some challenges are simply outside of the framework of Yazidi Survivors Law. They are related to the general problems in the governance and administrative system of Iraq. But I think what the political will for implementation of this law really cannot be denied. I mean, in the last 3.5 years, there was really nobody who would say that this law should be abolished or should be that the funding should stop. I think that everybody see value that this law brings in supporting Yazidi and Shabak and Turkmen and Christian community in Iraq.
Thank you. Final question, turning a little bit to your background. So if it's okay to speak about, I know you've been doing, you've previously worked in the countries which are today sort of Western Balkans, such as the documentation of international crimes, working on reparations and truth and so on. And I wondered whether you might be able to share a little bit of your experience there and the lessons that you've learned working in a totally different context, or perhaps you might say quite similar context, and some of the things that you've already seen sort of implemented in Iraq in terms of replicating what went well or avoiding pitfalls, working with government officials and civil society and so on. I wonder whether you draw parallels quite often, or any insights on that would be really interesting. Thank you for your time.
Yes. Yeah, well, I rarely compare these two contexts because they are they are quite different in terms of the nature of the conflict and the society fabric, the post-conflict period, and how the transitional justice came about in the Balkans. Transitional justice processes really came about under the pressure of international community, whereas in Iraq it's more organic, I would say. And I didn't mention this before, but I think it probably should have that. One of the most important reasons why the Yazidi Survivors Law was adopted is the fact and the courage of Nadia Murad, who have spoken so early, after her, so quickly after her captivity, spoken about what happened to her, and she had the courage to go on a global level and speak to global public about what happened. And I think really this changed the perspective on what happened to Yazidi women and other women from other communities under ISIS. It changed the paradigm of conflict-related sexual violence, not only in Iraq, but globally as well, which was, of course, then recognized through the Nobel Peace Prize award to Nadia Murad and Dr. Denis Mukwege. So not many parallels. I would say that the role of civil society organizations in both contexts are pretty the same. I mean, the courageous individuals and a wide range of and types of support for the affected communities and victims. This is something where the parallel exists. Documentation work, which is really important. But I think that parallels stop somewhere around civil society engagement. From this distance, I think that transitional justice in the Western Balkan is now in regression. And that it's a very long and complicated story, and of course everybody would come with their own theory why this process is in regression now in the Balkans. But I do believe that this interplay between the international community pressure and the organic bottom-up processes really didn't go hand in hand together, and that probably for longer period of time, I mean, more than necessary, we local actors were relying more on international community, but also, we thought that the international community will resolve everything and will address everything, especially after the establishment of International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. We saw that effort as only a beginning, but at the end, it was the beginning and the end of the transitional justice in the former Yugoslavia, with some important exceptions. Of course, there are a lot of prosecutions in Bosnia, national prosecutions, even for genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes. But really, Bosnia is outlier in the region in terms of the national prosecutions. What is really discouraging and disappointing now, 30 years or 25 years after Kosovo conflict ended, is that the narratives and inter-ethnic relations in the region are really in a bad place. I mean, there is a lot of hate speech. The younger generations who were born after the war really fall after and follow these nationalistic narratives. The education systems really are not are still full of these nationalistic narratives, and in general, yes, it's a very disappointing story, I would say, and very long story. I guess it's for another podcast.
Well, we should end on that then. But it's I think it's a good note to end on. These issues are that they're long lasting. That they're not quick fixes. And the what we've seen of the Yazidi Survivors Law so far in Iraq has brought a lot of hope to many and a lot of challenges to others. And I hope that people who've listened to this podcast are going away with a bit more understanding of IOM's role in particular in the conversation. And stay tuned to follow C4JR's work as well, because we're hoping to share even more updates over the coming weeks and months, and we'll be continuing to advocate for the implementation of the law. So thank you very much, Sandra, for your time and your incredible support and your knowledge and insights. It's been really lovely to chat to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alana.